2 talks today, so there's another talk at 3 p.m. for those of you that are left wanting more after this one. So Dr. Lopez obtained a PhD in cognitive psychology from Texas A&M University in 2015, after which she was awarded the Carlos Castaneda Postdoctoral Fellowship at the Center for Mexican American Studies at UT Austin. And she's now an assistant professor at UT Austin in the Department of Mexican American and Latinx Studies, where she directs the Latinos, Language, and Mexican American Studies Lab, also known as the GAMA Lab. She also holds courtesy appointments in the Department of Psychology, Department of Spanish and Portuguese, is a faculty affiliate at both the Center for Mexican American Studies and the Latino Research Institute, and she was recently awarded a fellowship through the Ford Foundation. So today she's going to tell us about her research program, which broadly focuses on how knowledge of 2 languages can shape cognition in terms of creativity, problem solving, decision making, and language access in Spanish, English, bilingual Latinx populations, and examining how early linguistic and cultural experiences can affect cognitive, linguistic, and health outcomes. So she was invited to our department as the second bridge scholar, and is going to tell us about our work today examining the role of language brokering in cognitive and language processing. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lopez.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara, for that lovely introduction. It is a mouthful, especially saying Mexican American and Latino Latina Studies. Don't worry, we're still working on it. Okay. All right, so I kind of changed the title of my talk, I think, from the flyer. So today I'll be talking about an examination of informal translation experiences. And I'll be talking about a recent paper of mine where I'm trying to make the case for bilingualism researchers to begin to examine language brokering within bilingualism studies. But first, I really want to applaud your graduate students that brought me and have done everything. Deborah, who, I don't know if she's here. Yeah, Deborah, who emailed me in the summer. It was like the nicest email to receive. And someone's like, we want to bring you. Also, this is my first time ever being somewhere else that's not in Texas. I've never taught. So thank you so much. And like Sarah, who's been like navigating me everywhere. You're amazing. And everyone else. And then Shangha, who's driving me later. Thank you for letting me do that. But it's been great. Also, you have weather here. I'm not used to that. We have hot, really hot in Texas, or at least central Texas. But while you're here today, let me get back to the talk. So really today, what I really want to do is kind of show you how I got into the study of language brokering. So as an undergrad, I was really interested in research on bilingualism. I'm a bilingual myself. I grew up speaking Spanish at home, and English was something I acquired at school and literally along the way. Today I'll go over the impact of bilingualism kind of historically and how we view bilingualism in cognitive research. And then I really want to get into what language brokering is. So I promise I'll explain what that is here in a bit. And then I want to go over some studies I've done in my lab on how, and make some suggestions as to how I think we can begin to incorporate language brokering experiences into the study of bilingualism. So first, I want to bring up, well, what is a bilingual, right? I define bilingual, an individual who's bilingual as someone who has working knowledge or just knowledge of 2 languages. And they can vary in how they speak their 2 languages, write their 2 languages, or even understand and communicate with them, because I'll explain this a little bit more. But I also want to show Princess Charlotte. If you remember a couple years ago, it was making the rounds on BBC like, oh my gosh, Princess Charlotte is a bilingual at age 2. I'm like, that's great, but she's also a princess. But then if you think about marginalized communities who use bilingualism every single day, why aren't we valuing their experiences like Princess Charlotte? So it's something to think about for us. So now I want to turn our attention to thinking about the impact of bilingualism and how it's been studied in cognitive research. So I'll give you a sort of, it's not a history lecture, but just a little bit. In the 1920s, there was a famous study by Smith in the UK where he examined bilingual outcomes in children. And he compared English monolingual children to Welsh English bilingual children, and found that bilingual children didn't perform as well as the monolingual children, and said that maybe bilingualism leads to cognitive deficiencies, it's detrimental, second language takes up too much space in the brain. You're like, that doesn't make sense. But this led to, but the major problem in this study was that he didn't control for socioeconomic status. And that Welsh English bilinguals came from a very low socioeconomic status, yet he was comparing them to a higher class of English monolinguals. So those of you that have done research, that's like not comparable, right? You don't do that, that's comparing apples to oranges. So what this led was to a plethora of studies between the 1920s and 1960s that talked about bilingualism as being detrimental and actually cautioning parents to not teach a second language to their children, which, if we also know about this era, this was also the time of intelligence testing, right? So what ended up happening, especially in Latinx communities, a lot of kids who spoke Spanish at home were given academic tests in English, and then when they didn't perform well, were put into remedial courses or said they're cognitively deficient, which also doesn't make any sense. But then in 1962, the seminal study by Elizabeth Kuhl and Wallace Lambert actually compared French-English bilingual children in Montreal to monolingual English children as well. And what Kuhl and Lambert did that Smith hadn't done is that he controlled for socioeconomic status. And he actually found that bilinguals outperformed the monolinguals. And in the literature, we tend to cite this study as kind of the study that changed everything for a few years. So up through the 1960s, we see a lot of work that talks about bilingualism as being advantageous, leading to cognitive advantages in executive function. We also see increased creativity, and there have been a couple of studies that talk about being bilingual leading to a delayed onset of Alzheimer's, which that sounds great, right? Like being bilingual has some cognitive benefits, but as with everything, there's always a downturn. In about 2011, we start seeing a series of replication failures that actually fail to find a bilingual advantage. And some of them even say that there might be a monolingual advantage, which that doesn't make any sense either, because then you can't communicate with more people. But again, what I want to show here is that, like with everything, there's upticks in like positive research, then it's negative, and then it's positive, and then it's negative. So kind of depressing, right? But what might be going on here? So it might be that there are inconsistencies in how we think about these tasks that measure cognitive control. We might think that tasks like the Simon effect as well as the flanker task are measuring the exact construct, but maybe there aren't. And something I examined in my research is, why are we thinking of all bilinguals as being bilinguals? Right? Bilingual experiences are very different. A bilingual growing up in New York City is very different from a bilingual growing up in Texas. Right? So we should really think about those individual differences. So now I want to show you kind of, like we had the sort of, what I call like the negative era of bilingualism, and then after the 1960s, we have a sort of, yay, positive bilingualism is awesome, and then it's negative again. And I want to draw your attention to 2014, because I really want to highlight what I call a seminal paper in the field of bilingualism. Sherry Baum and Deborah Tatone, this is one of my favorite papers, I think, ever, where they really bring front and center the issues of what's going on with this literature in bilingualism. And they also talk about why we need to examine individual differences and not just use monolinguals as a comparison, right? Some people have used the analogy of comparing apples to oranges, where are you really going to take a bilingual and compare it to a monolingual? That might work, and we have some differences, but it's also important to shift the literature a little bit. And what I want to highlight today is that we know that not all bilinguals are the same. Bilinguals live in a social context, and they use their languages in very distinct ways. Some folks may use their language for only religious purposes. Some of us use language in very academic settings. I constantly tell my students, I grew up speaking Spanish at home, and English was at school, and English became my academic language. And I still speak, read, and write in Spanish, but if I were to try to write an academic paper, someone might take my PhD away. I hope they don't. But it's important to show those distinctions between academic and also personal language. And situating it into the United States, we also have this push for English should be the official language. You see these programs about English only. So some folks, especially in immigrant communities, when they move to the United States, they tell their children, don't speak our language anymore, because we don't want you to be tagged as those immigrants, right? And we've heard this especially in the current political dialogue. So I want to situate bilinguals in the United States, because that's the bilinguals that I studied, particularly in Texas. So we know in the United States that about 85% of individuals speak a language other than English at home. And we know that we're a nation with about 40 million immigrants. So just think about those numbers, right? This is a nation with a lot of immigrants. And then when we start thinking about immigrants, if they bring their kids to the United States, how might that look? So we know that 33% of children also live in a home where a language other than English is spoken. And a recent study in 2010 shows that out of all the children in the United States, about 25% of them are immigrant children. So a question that I became interested, one, because of my own experience as a child of immigrants, was thinking about, well, if your parent moves to the US and they don't speak English, but you're acquiring English because you're at school, what might happen, right? Well, children are then called upon by their parents to translate and interpret. Right, so this is a term in the literature known as language brokering. We also see terms as cultural mediators or cultural brokers, natural translators was also a term used in the past. And I use, if you remember the movie Spanglish from the early 2000s, Adam Sandler, he's not that important. But Paz was kind of like the nanny or caretaker in the movie, and she has limited knowledge in English. And in a lot of scenes, she relies on her daughter to translate for her, right? And this is something that a lot of immigrant children do. This is something I even grew up through engaging in, and I still kind of engage in translating. So what else do language brokers do? Do they just translate between the two languages? Well, language brokers can translate in a lot of different situations, such as translating at a doctor's office. They're mediating information between the parent and the medical provider from one language to another, but they're also having to take into account cultural information. In Spanish, we have the formal versus informal, which also varies across different Spanish varieties. So you have to be able to say something in one language, understand it, and then reformulate it in a comprehensive, also respectful way for your own parents. But translators also, or language brokers also work in the school system, translating for their parents and parent-teacher conferences, or filling out job applications or even green card, important government forms. So if you think about government forms, even filling out for your own driver's license, sometimes that has really sophisticated language. And we know that language brokers start translating about 8 years old. So imagine having to fill that out as like an 8-year-old and maybe some academic like English that you haven't necessarily acquired in school yet, right? We're still learning how to read, but if you're having to read but also translate from one language to another, what might be going on here? All right, so you might be wondering at this point, well, what do we know about the research on language brokering? So similar to the bilingualism literature, there's both positive and negative outcomes related to this experience. So some of the positive outcomes that has been found in young children and adolescents is that it's actually a really great experience for kids. They feel happy, they feel proud about being able to connect their parents between their home culture and, say, American culture. It's also related to feeling closer to their home culture. They feel maybe more bicultural. It's also connected to increased academic achievement, including standardized test scores as well as grades, which that sounds pretty great, right? Like you're doing something and it has some positive long-term outcomes. And in terms of language, we also see things like first language maintenance. There are also enhanced meta-linguistic awareness, so knowledge about your two languages, which also sounds really great. And Guadalupe Valdez has some really great work where she actually talks about brokering as a form of giftedness, that not all children actually are going to be language brokers. And in the literature, we also see that language brokers tend to be the oldest. And if we know there's probably, usually the oldest were the smartest, right? Or that's what some literature says. And it also tends to be the oldest female. So there might be a gender component that also needs to be examined. But I've shown you all the positive stuff, there's also some downturns. So in young adolescents, we see increased depression. Because if you think about having to translate, even as an adult, that can be kind of stressful, but if you're a child or adolescent and you're having to tell your parents some medical information that's not so great, that might lead to increased depression, as well as stress, anxiety, and we even see some research that suggests that there might be alcohol abuse or substance abuse. And depending on even the relationship a child has with their parent, there's been work that suggests there's strained parent-child relationships, especially if the parent is maybe questioning the child as they're performing a translation, like, are you doing it correctly? Or are you sure what they said? And you can only imagine the sort of interaction that might lead to. So clearly, I'm interested in the effects of bilingualism, but I'm also interested in the effects of language brokering. And with the language brokering research, something that in graduate school that I became interested in was, well, we're seeing all these sociocultural effects, but what about the long-term cognitive and linguistic outcomes? They're using language brokers are using language in a very sophisticated way. Maybe there's some effects, right? And I'm also interested in looking at it in a very experimental way, because most of these studies were correlational in nature and also very survey or even interview. So basically, and for the rest of the talk, I really want to talk about how researchers interested in language brokering, how we can take into account how this might affect bilingual outcomes. But also, even in the literature on bilingualism, which is kind of all over the place sometimes, it's important to look at important individual differences like language brokering, especially one that's very common in the United States as well as other globalized nations. So for the next portion of my talk, I really want to talk about how we can begin to incorporate language brokering into research, into bilingualism research. So for the rest of the talk, I'll talk about 4 ways in which I'm proposing that we should look at them, but first talking about the variability of language brokering as well as the emotionality involved in language brokering, and then talking about centrality, a concept that one of my colleagues has come up with, and then I want to show some recent data from my lab on looking at how language brokering may even affect decision making. So first, I want to talk about some of my theoretical frameworks. Belem recently published and proposed her bilingual adaptation framework, which I think is very great because she talks about how if you grow up with using 2 languages, that's definitely going to affect some long-term cognitive and neurocognitive outcomes, especially in your language use and your knowledge of 2 languages. But I want to take this a bit further and say that language brokering above and beyond 2 language knowledge has some long-term effects. But I also being in an ethnic studies department now, I really think about context. So here I also want to include the unified theory of language brokering that talks about how individual, family, and community factors lead to different experiences within language brokering. So what I'm hoping to demonstrate here is that a language broker is not just an individual, but it's an individual in a context. And those contexts have an effect on the long-term effects of language brokering. Further, I'm particularly interested in how language brokering is a very unique experience that basically intersects with cognitive, emotional, linguistic, and social environments and may have some really interesting effects in how we think about bilingualism as a whole. So briefly, I do want to talk about some experimental work that has led me to think about these effects. One of my first studies, we looked at the effects of language brokering by comparing language brokers to bilinguals who didn't have as much experience, who we call the language non-brokers. And we found that when we gave them a categorization task, say they had to generate exemplars in Spanish 1 week and then English in another, say animals, they might think of like dog, cat, then a week later they come in and they might think of like perro, gato in Spanish. We found that language brokers actually thought of more similar items across languages as opposed to the non-brokers. So my colleague and I decided, well, maybe there's a more unified semantic organization in which you're able to closer group together your concepts across languages, which is kind of neat if you think about it. If you're having to translate, you're having to mediate between 2 languages, maybe that's doing something to even your language access. So in some follow-up studies, I really wanted to see if bilinguals were good at processing language, and we gave them phrases in both figurative phrases, like idiomatic expressions like kick the bucket, and literal phrases, figurative phrases, and then we gave them a target word, say like kick the bucket, and you know the idiomatic meaning for that is death in English. But I wanted to see, do you access an idiomatic meaning across languages? So we give them something like kick the bucket, and then in Spanish, morir, and our brokers were much faster and more accurate than our non-brokers at identifying, which is really neat if you think about it, because idiomatic expressions are really ingrained in a language and a culture. So there's something to say about language brokering here. I also just really like idioms. And then we also did a creativity task. I created a Spanish version of the Remote Associates task, which has been used to measure verbal creativity. And we actually found that language brokers and non-brokers performed equally well in English at generating solutions for a Remote Associates task, which makes sense. Most of my participants grew up in English programs, not a lot of Spanish. But the brokers did better in Spanish than the non-brokers. So there's something also to say about language brokering experience, maybe enhancing your first language. So, and then there's some recent work by Vanessa Rainey, who's started to look at executive function within bilinguals or language brokers. And she's also found that language brokering is related to cognitive flexibility or increased cognitive flexibility. But in the same paper, she also found that brokering didn't enhance syntactic awareness. So maybe there are very different dimensions in where language brokering has effects. So, but this is great. Most of these studies, I'm excited because they found something. But again, I talked about variability of language brokers. So just like bilingualism, I think we need to talk about language brokering as not being categorical. It's not that someone who is a language broker is a language broker, right? There might be different contexts that might lead to different effects. It might be that someone who frequently translated for their parents as a child, maybe as they got older, they stopped translating because their parents became proficient in English. So being able to examine that maybe in a survey is important to look at as well. But also the context of language brokering. And I'll talk about this in one of the studies I'll go over here in a bit. One of my students talked about, well, I only translate for my parents when it's taxes. So that's a very specific context where you're translating. I've had other participants who talk about, well, I only translate in doctor's offices. And if you think about medical jargon, that's pretty sophisticated. And you might have some knowledge about, I had a student talk about hospice, and they knew everything about hospice because they had that experience with their family. So again, thinking about the different contexts of language brokering, which may have long-term effects. And I bring up here the use of two languages, especially with parents. If one parent does become bilingual in English, then they may no longer translate for that parent, so they may actually just use more Spanish with another parent, and that's important to examine as well. And then also think about the variation of language brokering over the lifetime. And I'll go over this a little bit more with my second study that I'll show. But you might translate more at home, but when someone goes off to college, they're probably not going to be at home, and it's going to be harder for the parents to rely on them to translate. Other forms of variability in language brokering. Language brokering can be seen as just a one-to-one translation, right? You translate between, say, Spanish and English or other languages, but also cultural brokering. You're not just translating the linguistic information, but you're really having to take into account cultural knowledge as you mediate between interlocutors. But again, bringing up the context, and I bring up a TV here, they don't do this anymore, but thinking about is if the language brokers have to translate mainly when they're at home watching Netflix with their parents, that's going to be a very different experience as opposed to someone who's translating in a doctor's office. This might involve more dialogue. So that might affect the way you access different words, but also in the way you think about language. And then I bring up IRS here because setting up a profile for your parents for income tax purposes, right? That's also a different set of lexical items, and it's also a different procedure. So I think examining these different variations is important. All right, so also, and I bring up here emotionality because as people translate in different instances, that's going to spark different emotions, right? If you're translating in a medical office, that might be a little stressful as opposed to translating maybe in a post office. That's pretty low stakes. Like maybe my parents just have to pay a little bit more in postage. But if you translate incorrectly in a medical office, that has some very terrible long-term effects. So I became interested in, well, if language brokering experiences lead to both positive and negative emotional outcomes, how might that intersect with language abilities, and how might that have long-term effects on bilingual cognition? So shifting gears a little bit, thinking about what we know about emotion, cognition, and language, Annetta Pavlenko's theory of language embodiment suggests that for bilinguals, their socialization in their first language leads to an integration of both emotional, cognitive, tactile information, right? So, and that renders the first language as the more emotional language, right? So that's interesting. I want you to hold on to that for a little bit. But then, if we think about what we know about stress and emotional experiences for young children at an early age, we know that has long-term effects on cognitive abilities, right? So language brokers are bilingual, and sometimes they may have stressful or emotional experiences, right? So with my colleagues, we were interested in, well, what happens if you have a stressful, maybe emotional experience in language brokering, but your first language is Spanish, or you're a bilingual who's learned two languages early on. How might those two things intersect? And then some of the psycholinguistic work, we see that there's slower reaction times for emotional stimuli. So we started trying to dissect this, but also throw it all together and see what happens. So in a paper that we have under review, we were particularly interested in how does L1 proficiency and emotional language brokering experience affect executive functionability, right? So the ability to shift, pay attention to, or inhibit information. So here I want to show the study design, or how we conceptualize this study. So we were interested in brokers who had like maybe low emotional experiences to high negative emotional experiences, and then we wanted to look at it in conjunction with proficiency, so low proficiency compared to high proficiency. And we hypothesized that for language brokers who had high L1 proficiency, that their executive functionability would not be hindered, because previous research suggests that high L1 or first language proficiency, it actually helps executive functionability. But where we were thinking we would see more of the effects was those with low first language proficiency, maybe they moved away from speaking Spanish, these are Spanish-English bilinguals, and speaking more English. But we thought that for those with high negative brokering experience along with low first language proficiency, this is where we'd see the greatest effects. So talking about the study a little bit, so we tested 53 Mexican-American Spanish-English bilinguals, and we had them self-rate their Spanish proficiency and their English proficiency. So you can see here most of them, their English proficiency is much higher than their Spanish proficiency. Again, these are bilinguals in Texas, bilingual education, as you know, in Massachusetts, doesn't exist. In Texas, it does now? I thought that
It came back.
it came back. Okay, I knew of a question too, or?
Yeah, 2002, 2017.
Okay. Okay, that makes me really happy. Texas needs to bring up, we have some bilingual education programs, but it's still not that, it could be better. That's for questions after you can talk to me about that. But then we also had them write their emotional experiences. So, and this was primarily just for mother, because we found that most of our sample had translated more frequently for their mother, as opposed to their father, which again is another question that needs to be examined. Like, why is it that you translate more for your mother? Is there some gender effect? Maybe the father doesn't want to be have their child translate for them. And we had them answer questions like, for negative emotions, like I get an example here, I become impatient when my mother asks me to translate for her. Or positive emotions like, how often do you feel excited when you have to translate for your parents? And you can see, this is on a scale of, I believe it was a 1 to 5 on this one. And we had participants do a assignment task. So they came into the lab and we told them, you know, anytime you see a red square, we need you to press the button with a red square using your left index finger, and anytime you see a blue square, press the button with your right index finger. And we manipulated on which side of the screen the box appeared, right? So if the box appeared on the same side, that would be fairly easy, right? But if it appears on the other side, you really have to inhibit wanting to press the blue square. And we alternated between red and blue squares. And we measured the reaction time and accuracy rates on this task. And we did some linear mixed effects modeling, and our bus model had a 3-way interaction, which was fun and exciting, between trial type Spanish proficiency and negative feelings, and I'll show you a graphic that kind of explains this a little bit more. So then, how do you tease apart a 3-way interaction, especially with continuous variables? We split up our participants between high Spanish proficiency and high negative feelings, and then high Spanish proficiency and low negative feelings, and then into low Spanish proficiency, high negative feelings, and then what we call the low group. So and then on the y-axis we have the reaction time, and in darker bars we have the incongruent trials, which if we know from executive function, those should be the slower ones because they really have to inhibit misleading information. But contrary to what we thought we were going to find, we were expecting these groups, right? We expected them to be much faster and maybe not demonstrate assignment effect, but it was kind of contradictory. And when you have those effects, you're like, why did this happen? How can I explain this? And then these have a small, the low Spanish proficiency group actually had the smallest assignment effect, which we were thinking, oh no, this means they're like, high proficiency is not related to enhanced executive control. How can we tease this apart? Luckily, sitting with my colleagues and being able to tease this out, we're like, no, this makes absolute sense. Because if you think about it, these are the low proficiency, low emotional feelings. We're thinking maybe these are the bilinguals who are less engaged in their language experiences, or they really didn't care about having to be a broker. And in the next slide, I'll explain why we interpreted that. So we found that low negative feelings and low Spanish proficiency did have display the smallest assignment effect, but we think that this might be a low integration of their language experience, of their linguistic experience, as well as emotional language experience. And you know, it's contrary to previous work that finds that high L1 proficiency should enhance executive functionability, which that could be neither here or there, but we do see with that high proficiency, they did have faster reaction times overall. So maybe we're still kind of supporting that work, but not really. But the takeaway for this study was that L1 proficiency and emotionality are important factors to examine when we're looking at executive functionability within bilinguals. Because if we know the previous studies, they just compared bilinguals to monolinguals, but looking at the emotional and linguistic outcome, emotional and linguistic experiences might lead to different effects, right? And it doesn't have to be detrimental, but they're just different. And we're still continuing this work. And as we started some of this work, we were interested, well, what about language brokers and how they actually feel about their experience, right? Like, was it important to them? And maybe that has some long-term effects. So my colleague Soo-Young Kim has really, I think, really great work on how important are brokering experiences to the brokers themselves. And so when we think about bilingualism, we don't really ask those questions in psycholinguistics. So I thought, well, why don't we ask brokers themselves how they reflect about their experiences and even tie in cognitive outcomes? So in another study, my colleagues and I asked asked a group of bilingual young adults who are college-age students how they actually reflected about their previous language brokering experiences now as college students. So we interviewed 10 Spanish-English bilingual language brokers and asked them questions about the context of language brokering, the frequency of language brokering, maybe some of their brokering strategies, like what happened when you didn't know a word, like what did you do to solve that problem, because that's a major issue. And we also asked them about, like, how did that experience feel to you? Like, how is that important to you? And I'm going to show a couple of quotes. This is my dabble into qualitative research, which was fun. So here I show Carmen, and I'll read her quote briefly. We asked her, how was language brokering important to you? And she said, no, I guess it makes me me. Makes me me. When you see someone at the store that needs help, she's like, okay, I'm going to help them versus they can just figure it out on their own. And what I think is really neat about this quote is two things. She really talks about it being important to herself. So maybe it's even important to her own identity as a person or even as a bilingual. But it also shows some empathy, right? Like, you know, say you're going to the grocery store and you see someone having trouble with maybe finding an item and someone's trying to help them out, and you just step in, you're like, oh, let me help you, I speak Spanish, or I speak your language. So this is kind of interesting, and you should examine that. But here I want to show Lorenzo, who when we asked him, what did you think about brokering when you were brokering the most, so say when he was a child, he did not like it. He was like, I'm not that great, I'm not so great at it, I guess. I mean, I can translate, but sometimes I tend to struggle in translating. But then when we asked him, how do you think about it now, he said it feels good at one point because you're like actually helping another person and trying to understand. They're asking you for help or translating because you're the only one who knows both languages. And I really like this quote because his perception changed. And I think maybe when he was younger, maybe his Spanish proficiency was starting, maybe went down at some point. So maybe he felt pressured to translate accurately. And if you can't translate well, and maybe your parents are telling you to translate something perfectly, that might actually lead to some stress. And then now as an adult, he's like, well, it makes you feel good because you're the only one who knows. So again, kind of validating his own experience, like, I'm a bilingual, I can do something, which I think is handy. And here we have Santiago. This is also one of my favorite quotes of his, or out of the study, where he talks about my own language skills, and I mean, I'm learning a third language right now. I mean, like, it's giving me a doorway to other languages. And I think what's really neat about this one is he talks about it as a doorway, as something that prompted him to learn another language. And I don't remember what language he told us he was learning, but there might be something about language brokering experiences that motivate language skills, maybe in retaining your two languages, but also acquiring new languages. Two more quotes from the study. Here we also asked Valentina, and she said, oh, it makes me really feel good about myself because I'm helping someone, not like in the translating way, but helping them understand and motivating to expand their language as well. So here, similar to the previous participant, she talks about it making her feel really good about herself, but then also helping and motivating others to learn. So again, kind of showing the sort of empathy towards others, like I want to help someone and so they can learn a language. And then this is the last quote from the study. Roberto, where again, we saw the same thing. Generally, I would feel good about myself because I know both languages and I could go back and forth between speaking English or Spanish or vice versa. And what's neat about his quote is that he even he didn't mention it explicitly, but code switching, right? Like switching between two languages. And he actually valued that and being able to switch two languages, which in education sometimes we're told, oh, you shouldn't mix your two languages because that means you don't have the two languages. So being able to do this as a language broker was validating, at least in his experience. So overall themes in this paper, we found that the frequency of language brokering changed over time, especially when they were at home as opposed to now as college students, but also the context. One of our participants said, I talked about this earlier, like now he only translated when his parents need help with IRS, or the mom gets something in the mail that's usually government forms. But we also see that their feelings about brokering tend to change, which I think is really important and validating to think about maybe at the time that younger kids are studied when we look at language brokering may have certain effects, but then when you ask them when they're adults, that may have different outcomes. So it's important to know, like, to take that into account as well. But then also thinking about benefits of brokering. A lot of these talks about it's important to me, so maybe it's something that's actually part of their identity. And what I was interested in, I don't show the quotes here, was asking them about language brokering strategies. And I've talked to a few of you about this, but when we asked them, like, what did you do when you didn't know a word? Some of them said, well, I would say the English word in a Spanish accent. So maybe my mom knew what I was saying, but what's really interesting there is that it becomes a collaborative event, right? Because then if the mom can kind of think of the word, they're going to resolve whatever ambiguities that they're dealing with. I think my favorite quote from a student, or from one of our participants, was saying, like, I would tell a story around the word and then have my parents kind of figure it out. But if you're thinking about, if you're like 8 or 9 years old telling a story, I think that's really creative, right? That's showing some advanced cognitive and like problem-solving strategies, right? Maybe it's just, but in terms of linguistics, I think that knowing about the importance of language brokering to the individual tells us really something about being able to maintain a language, but also acquisition of maybe a third or even a fourth language, but as well as language dominance. We had I think it was Roberto who said, oh, I hated it when I was a kid because I'm not that good at it. Maybe if someone's not that good at brokering, they're more likely to become more dominant in English or shift their language, right? To no longer want to speak the heritage language because this experience is very difficult. And the next step I'll get into is like, I'm really interested in like what happens in strategy development or problem-solving abilities. Especially when participants started telling us things about like, well, I couldn't think of a word, so this is what I would do. And I think that's really interesting to maybe take the next step and look at more domain general cognition in language brokering, which is actually what I'll be talking about in the last bit of this talk. So we know from language brokers are problem solvers and decision makers, right? They have to mediate certain interactions. Say a parent tells their child, like, hey, we have this charge on the credit card. Did you do this? And you're like, no. But then you might have to call the credit card and say, we have this extra charge. What do we do? Right? So I tell my students, like, have you ever had to do that? And they're like, no. These are like 22-year-olds. But if you ask someone who's a language broker, oh yeah, when I was 9. They're like, that makes sense. But I also bring up the example of like having to set up internet, right? If your parents don't speak the language, they might have you read it and you have to figure out which is the internet package that we want. And we have Suddenlink in Austin. It's usually, you get a super cheap one for a year, but then a year later it bumps up to like $100 million. So if you're a child and you're having to make that decision, do you know like, oh, it's going to change in a year? Or do you just see it's going to be, $29.99 for 12 months? Right, so language brokers are engaged in these sort of experiences, and I think that merits a future investigation. And the work on bilingualism and decision making, well, it's fairly new, but it tends to focus on foreign language learners. And some of this work by Albert Costa found that foreign language decisions are easier to make, and they might be less intuitive because of a distance between languages. But if I think about bilinguals in the United States and language brokers, they acquired both languages early on, so maybe this doesn't necessarily make sense for them. So, of course, we did a study, because I wanted to see what happened, and we asked, well, does language brokering affect decision-making ability? So we had about 202 Mexican-American Spanish-English bilingual language brokers, and we had them, and this is important to show, we had them self-rate their Spanish and English ability, and again, you can see they do rate their English more, but most of these students have had K through 12 and even now college, primarily in English, so this makes sense. And we had them also rate their language brokering experiences, and my co-author said, let's look at language dominance, because we see that there's a significant difference between Spanish and English, and she was really interested in, does dominance have an effect? So we calculated a dominance score by subtracting overall Spanish proficiency from English to see, like, are they more English dominant or Spanish dominant? And I'll talk that a little bit more. And then we had them do an Iowa gambling task, because gambling sounded like fun. So I'll show you this task. So we had participants come into the lab, and we tell them, today we're going to play a game. And we're going to give you, you're going to see 4 decks of cards, and your task is to choose a deck. And what's going to happen is anytime you choose a deck, you might win some money, other times you might lose some money. I don't know how much money you're going to win or lose at any given point, but sometimes you might win a lot of money with certain decks, and with other decks you might not lose as much money. So some decks are more advantageous, and other decks are not as advantageous. And we would tell the participants, we're giving you $2,000, not real $2,000, but the goal of the game is to win as much money without losing so much money. So they would see the 4 decks, and on the keyboard we had A, B, or C, and they would press whichever deck they wanted. So say someone chose B, they'd get some feedback, and like, yay, you got $100, and now you have $2,100, right? And they did this for about 100 trials, and we We measured their deck choice as well as reaction time. And then we did some linear mixed effects modeling. And our bus model, you can see here we didn't have any effect of language dominance in deck choice. So did language brokers choose the more risky decks as opposed to advantageous decks? But we did see, and then I didn't explain this. We calculated different contexts of language brokering. One that we called it life skills brokering, where we looked at the frequency of translating, say, credit card bills or telephone bills, what we call life skills. And maybe that may affect decision making. And then we also looked at context in terms of home and family. Like, did you translate more for your mother, father, and in the home? And the only two interactions that was significant was home family brokering and deck choice. So here I plotted home family brokering on a scale. We had it from 1 to 5, and this is just their average. And then we have their reaction time. I have reaction time on the y-axis. And then we have risky versus non-risky decks. And what we determined, or we're still trying to figure this out, so I would love some feedback. We think that maybe the more home brokering, people are much slower for non-risky decks. And the way we thought about this is maybe you're a more cautious decision maker. So even when you think that you've chosen maybe the non-risky deck, you're going to be a little bit slower. And we're still trying to figure out, but there might be other trends, when you're kind of home broker, maybe half of the time, we don't think this will be very significant. So we're still trying to figure out what this actually might mean. So for this study, we decided, well, it might be that different tasks or domains of language brokering have effects on decision making. And it would be important to see, maybe if you broker more in certain contexts, that's going to affect your decision making as opposed to others. And it's probably some wrapping up. So some conclusions about this work. We know that language brokering experiences are a direct result of systemic and individual factors, including immigration and policy, which I think is a really unique experience that we need to begin to examine, particularly as bilingualism researchers. And in my last slide, language brokering is both a cognitive, linguistic, emotional, and sociocultural experience that really lets us look at intersecting effects that may have enduring and illuminating effects, especially on bilingual processing. And it's important to look at language brokering because it tells us something about a very specialized experience that tells us something about bilingual abilities, but it also spans the lifetime. So I think it's an interesting way to examine bilingual outcomes. And finally, I do want to say thank you to my collaborators and my mentors, and also my funders, and then shout out to all the immigrant kids that serve as translators for their parents, especially when you're a kid and have to try your best to translate words you don't know yet. I always hope I guessed right. So.
So if you examine this kind of change over time in the children's experiences as a child and growing up as a college student, I presume there might be change in the parents' language experiences and their acquisition and improvement in the English language, for example. Did you look at that at all? Is that available in this data set? And if so, what kind of role would that play?
No, that's an awesome question, and my colleagues Sion Kim and I are actually looking at that. It tends to be, so our NSF grant is actually looking at adolescents who are transitioning from middle school to high school, and we actually collect some data on both the parents and the child, and we see that the parents tend to not actually learn a lot of English, because they also come from very low socioeconomic status, which is something that is, I don't think I mentioned enough in this talk. So sometimes there aren't resources, or parents are working all the time, and they have working knowledge of English, but it won't be in the same capacity as their child. So does that answer?
Yeah, I guess my main question was the child's perception of, or their need to translate for their parents might change over time too.
Yeah,
And I guess.
I think it definitely would, right? If you see that or maybe even the child wanting their parents to learn English, they may not want to translate anymore. And there's some work that shows that at least there are some even cultural differences between Latino students and Middle Eastern students and how they decide when they help their parents translate. Because some of them are like, I want my parents to learn English, so I don't want to translate it for them. I think in Latino culture there might be a little bit more pressure, where then why do I want you? You need to help me. Speaking from experience and from talking to students. Yeah. Yes.
really fascinating work.
Oh,
I'm thinking about some of the research on cognitive control and simultaneous interpreters, like in a professional sense, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are about what might be some of the differences between language brokers that have such a personal family investment in the experience and then those who work professionally as interpreters.
That's an awesome question, and I get that from reviewers all the time. They're asking, like, are there differences between brokers and simultaneous interpreters? And the answer is yes. Simultaneous interpreters are self-selected. They decide this is what I want to do as a career. And we do see, like, the interpreter advantage that people talk about. Laura Babcock is doing some really neat work, and we've had a few conversations about brokers and non-brokers. And brokers tend to, like, they get chosen by the parents, which I think is also really neat. And if someone wants to do that work, I'd love to read it. To look at, like, how a parent chooses which of their children gets to be a broker. I ask my parents all the time, and they're like, "You're just the smarter one." I'm like, "Of course," but I think that's also really interesting. But simultaneous interpreters get trained. Language brokers don't, and language brokers start at a much younger age. Studies show that it's mainly around 8 years old. And if you think about it in terms of like cognitive development, that's a really interesting age. And I keep telling people, like, I'm really interested in how they start at such a young age and how that has an effect. Because if they're at home until like 18, they go off to college, that's 10 years. Most places you're an expert. So why are language brokers seen as experts? Yes?
So I'm curious whether you have any experience with kids younger than 8, like say from 5 to 8.
I haven't, but I
And
think,
did you as a kid?
oh, I absolutely did it as a kid. Yeah.
From 5 to 8.
I would like to say it was from 5 to 8, but like some of my earliest ones are like going to parent-teacher conferences for my younger brother, who's only about a year younger than me. So I remember being in the 2nd grade, which was probably like 7, 8, and then translating for our first Miss Argo's class. But I don't know, and I think it would be neat.
I guess the thing that I'm interested about is I was always amazed that kids didn't intuitively know what translating was, and that 5-year-olds, it was real spotty. But I've seen very, very few studies, just years ago, something from Alice, Switzerland or something, where the kids, and so I'm real curious about how they develop that, meta-linguistic awareness that you're talking about. It's a very specific one, that even though they know, 2-year-olds go up and say, "You're teaching the wrong language, you're not supposed to teach it." Say that one, but they don't really get it. And I was just curious as to when they start really understanding that enough.
Yeah, I don't know, because it's, I think, and I'm going to talk about personal experience when I had to start translating, but it was like, both languages. And it was kind of like, it might be that parents assume that there is a one-to-one mapping. But we also know that bilingual kids figure out the label referent, like the label to a referent, they figure out that it's just a label. So that would be some really neat work. I've talked to Maria Redondo a few times, and I'm like, can we work with like bilingual babies, because she works with babies, and she's coming to UT in the spring, so I can. Maria Redondo, she does some FMIRS work and executive function work on bilinguals, and I haven't worked with kids very much, so I keep asking her to teach me. Yes?
Have you thought about expanding to look at tasks related to problem solving or assessing perseverance on problem solving? I was just thinking about that being a skill that might, as you're saying, someone's very creative and would come up with a story if they didn't know the word. And so have you thought about moving in that direction as well as sort of branching from executive function?
Yeah, because executive function is not my major area. I'm more interested in language processing. But I have collected some data on the abbreviated Torrance task. And I'm still, that's also a nonverbal sort of creativity problem-solving task that's given in more like gifted and talented. And we're still coding that data. But we had done some pre-analysis and presented at a conference when we were just looking at brokers and non-brokers. And we found that brokers did better on the verbal tasks and certain indicators for nonverbal creativity. But it was very specific. It was like thinking outside of the box, for lack of a better term. But I have thought about that quite a bit. Because I think it would be neat to look at it in non-linguistic terms, right? Because even though you're using linguistic information, you're still using other cognitive domains, which I think is neat.
I have a empirical question. So it seems like one of the things that a language broker gets is actual experience with the adult world, right? I mean, that a kid who's not in that language brokering situation doesn't necessarily get. I mean, when I think about what my kids know about the IRS and like, you know, how bank accounts really work, so it's zero, right? It's like close to zero. So is there any work looking at like, so if you take kids who are just coming into college who have had a language brokering experience versus like, you know, socioeconomically matched kids who have not, do they know a lot about the adult world and about institutions and how they work?
I haven't done that, and I think that would be a fascinating question, but I ask that in my class a lot of the time when I teach a bilingualism class, and when we talk about individual differences, or even in my Latinx psychology course, I'll ask students, like, how many of you knew how to balance a checkbook by the time you were 10? And you'll have students like, what? Yeah, so I think rhetorically people talk about that, like my students have talked about that, but that would be a great question.
Well, I wonder, and I mean the reason I'm asking is I wonder if some of the cognitive differences that might be detectable in the laboratory actually are mediated by the sort of experience with these adult institutions, which itself requires a lot of sort of decision-making, cognitive control, et cetera, right? So, I mean, they're having the experience of being a language broker, but they're also having the experience of interacting with the world, right? In a way that they wouldn't otherwise have to both.
Yeah, I think that would be a fun project to do, or even just like asking questions, like, did you have to do this, and trying to figure it out if it works out. Yeah, that would be a neat study. Yes?
I'm curious, in your quantitative study specifically, but in any of the work, if you saw variability in the way they talked about their social context, so whether that's like racial ethnic makeup of the neighborhoods, attitude towards immigrants where they grew up, or peers, or anything, and how that played into how they talk about their experiences.
So we do have questions, I do collect data on that, where I ask them about their racial ethnic composition in their high school, and I haven't looked at that. But it would be really interesting to see, so I'm in Central Texas, Austin is somewhat diverse. But if you go like into the valley of Texas, that's primarily Latinx. So like, it's just like El Paso, about like 90%. But and I haven't looked at that, but it would be really neat to compare them to say maybe a language broker in East Texas. Or I grew up in the Texas Panhandle, and I think that would be a really, I'm gonna look back at my data and I won't get you an answer. But it would be really neat to see that, right? Because at least in El Paso, like when I lived there for undergrad, like you would see people translate, but there's a lot more Spanish than there are in like other pockets. So I think that might also be a factor, like access to another language. But
And no one has any more questions. Sorry. Does anybody have any final questions before we wrap everything up?